Elijah Grant, a man of simple pleasures and a homeowner of 6 months, never anticipated that purchasing his little slice of suburban paradise would morph into a bizarre, Kafkaesque nightmare. He had envisioned weekends spent tinkering in his garage, hosting barbecues on his porch, and generally enjoying the fruits of his labor. Instead, he found himself locked in a silent, simmering feud with Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, a woman whose mission in life seemed to be the micromanagement of everyone's existence within the perfectly manicured confines of their community. From the moment Elijah moved in, Karen had been a thorn in his side. Her initial petty offenses, the citations for the grass being half an inch too high, or the welcome mat being too casual, were annoying, yes, but he had dismissed them as the quirks of an overzealous neighbor. He had naively believed that appeasement was the answer, diligently trimming his lawn, replacing his welcome mat with a more appropriate one, and even attempting to buff his car to a less distracting shine. But Karen's appetite for control was insatiable. She transitioned from petty grievances to a relentless barrage of HOA emails, demanding approval for every minor home improvement project, from painting his front door to installing a simple bird feeder. Elijah, however, refused to be bullied. He knew his rights, he owned his house, he paid his mortgage, and he wasn't about to kowtow to Karen's arbitrary demands. He chose to ignore most of her ridiculous requests, hoping that she would eventually tire of her one-sided battle. This, of course, was a grave miscalculation. Karen, fueled by a potent cocktail of entitlement and self-importance, interpreted Elijah's defiance as a personal affront. She saw him not as a neighbor, but as a rebel, a disruptive force threatening the delicate balance of her meticulously curated community. The tension escalated, each interaction dripping with thinly veiled hostility. Elijah found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, bracing himself for the next absurd complaint or ridiculous imposition. He felt like he was living under siege, his own home transformed into a battleground and Karen's personal war on individuality. Then came the breaking point, the incident that transformed the petty squabble into an outright declaration of war. When Elijah returned from his friend's wedding, sunburned and exhausted, he was confronted with a scene that defied all logic and reason. His house was inaccessible, barricaded behind steel bars, guarded by men in cheap security uniforms. The sight that greeted Elijah after his weekend away was surreal, a scene ripped straight from a dystopian movie. Steel bars, crudely bolted into his porch, transformed the front of his house into a makeshift fortress, an impenetrable barrier between him and his own home. Two individuals, clad in ill-fitting HOA-branded polo shirts, stood guard, their expressions betraying a mixture of discomfort and misplaced authority. For a moment, Elijah entertained the idea that this was some elaborate prank, a misguided attempt at humor gone horribly wrong. But the grim faces of the security guards quickly dispelled that notion. As Elijah approached, one of the guards stepped forward, his hand hovering nervously over his walkie-talkie. "This is a temporary HOA enforcement action," he announced, his voice lacking conviction. "You are currently prohibited from entering the premises due to repeated violations." Elijah stared at the guard, speechless. The audacity of the situation was so absurd, so utterly preposterous, that he could only manage a bewildered laugh. He assumed the guard was joking, playing along with some bizarre HOA-sponsored role-playing exercise. But the guard remained impassive, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "I'm serious, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are not authorized to enter the property." Elijah, finally regaining his composure, attempted to reason with the guard. He explained, calmly and patiently, that this was his house, that he owned it, that he had a mortgage and keys to prove it. He attempted to walk past the guard, but the man stood his ground, blocking his path. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said, his voice laced with a hint of desperation. "I'm just following orders." When Elijah demanded to know who had given these orders, the guard pointed to a crumpled clipboard, bearing Karen's name and a hastily scribbled ban list. The absurdity of the situation was escalating with each passing moment. Elijah felt a surge of anger building within him, a potent mix of frustration and disbelief. He decided to confront Karen directly. He asked the guard where she was, and the guard pointed to her house, 2 doors down. Fueled by righteous indignation, Elijah marched towards Karen's house, determined to put an end to this ridiculous charade. He pounded on her front door, his knuckles rapping with the force of his pent-up frustration. After several tense moments, the door creaked open, revealing Karen, resplendent in a silk robe, a smug smile plastered across her face. "Well, well, well," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension. "Look who decided to grace us with his presence." Elijah, barely containing his anger, demanded to know what was going on. He wanted to know why his house had been barricaded, and why he was being prevented from entering his own property. Karen, unfazed by his anger, launched into a self-righteous tirade about non-compliance and hostile aura energy. She informed him that the HOA board, which in reality consisted of herself and two individuals who owed her favors, had voted to temporarily suspend his residency due to his persistent violations of HOA rules. She claimed that his disruptive forces were a threat to the community, and that she, as the keeper of community harmony, had no choice but to quarantine him. Elijah, struggling to maintain his composure, informed Karen that she had absolutely no legal authority to do any of this. He reminded her that he owned his house, that he had a mortgage, and that he was entitled to live there without being subjected to her arbitrary rules and ridiculous pronouncements. Karen simply scoffed. She declared that she was acting in the best interests of the community, and that his rights were secondary to the need to maintain community vibrations. Elijah realized that he was dealing with someone who was completely detached from reality, someone who had convinced herself that she was above the law. He knew that he couldn't reason with her, that she was too far gone in her delusion of grandeur. He decided to take a different approach. Without saying another word, he pulled out his phone. He dialed a locksmith, requesting immediate assistance. Then, he called the non-emergency police line, reporting the unlawful obstruction of his property. The arrival of the police officers injected a dose of reality into the surreal situation. The HOA guards, suddenly aware of the potential legal ramifications of their actions, attempted to portray themselves as legitimate security personnel, acting under the authority of the HOA. One of them even went so far as to tell the officers that Elijah was a threat to the neighborhood aesthetic, a comment that elicited a collective eye roll from everyone present. Elijah, relieved to have the officers on the scene, calmly presented his ID, his mortgage paperwork, his property app, and even the Welcome to the Neighborhood flyer he had received 6 months earlier, bearing his name and address. The officers, after reviewing his documentation, walked over to Karen's porch, their expressions hardening with each step. That's when Karen's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The officers began questioning her about the HOA's enforcement procedures, the legitimacy of the board, and the basis for the ban list. As the officers drilled her with questions, Karen's composure began to crack. She became increasingly agitated, her voice rising in pitch as she attempted to justify her actions. It quickly became apparent that Karen's reign of terror was built on a foundation of lies and deception. She had never filed any of her ridiculous citations with the actual HOA management company. Her board was not officially registered. Her enforcement letters were just Word documents with fake legal logos. The final nail in Karen's coffin was the revelation that one of the HOA guards she had hired had a checkered past, having been banned from security work after tackling a shoplifter at a mall in another state. The officers, having gathered enough evidence to confirm that Karen was acting illegally and without authority, ordered her to remove the gate immediately or face code violations and civil liability. Karen, now completely unraveled, panicked. She launched into a final, desperate tirade, ranting about protecting the neighborhood from energy sabotage and enforcing community vibrations. The officers, unmoved by her frantic pleas, reiterated their demand. The gate had to come down. As the police officers' stern warnings echoed through the manicured lawns, Karen retreated into her house, slamming the door with a resounding thud. Her last words, screamed from behind the safety of her fortress, were a promise that the HOA would rise again. The HOA guards, realizing that their employer had just thrown them under the bus, began to disassociate themselves from the situation. One of them even took off his HOA polo shirt mid-conversation and tried to pretend he was just visiting, a pathetic attempt to distance himself from the unfolding drama. The gate, however, remained stubbornly in place. Karen, in her haste to erect the barrier, had installed it directly over Elijah's door hinges, making it impossible to remove without specialized tools. The fire department was called to the scene, and after a brief but noisy operation, the gate was finally unbolted and removed, allowing Elijah to finally access his own home. The sight of the mangled steel bars lying on his porch was a stark reminder of the absurdity he had just endured. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The HOA management company, horrified by Karen's actions, issued a statement condemning her behavior and assuring residents that she had been stripped of her position as president. The police launched an investigation into her activities, looking into possible charges of harassment, property damage, and impersonating a law enforcement officer. The media, alerted to the story by a neighbor, descended upon the neighborhood, eager to document the downfall of the infamous HOA Karen. Elijah found himself the unlikely hero of the hour, the victim of overreach who stood up to authority and won. He gave a few interviews, emphasizing the importance of standing up for one's rights and not allowing oneself to be bullied by those who abuse their power. The aftermath of the Gate incident, as it became known in the neighborhood, brought about a significant shift in the community dynamic. The HOA management company implemented stricter oversight procedures and implemented a new system for handling complaints, ensuring that no single individual could wield unchecked power. Neighbors, who had previously been hesitant to speak out against Karen, began to share their own stories of her petty tyranny and unreasonable demands. A sense of camaraderie emerged as residents bonded over their shared experience of being subjected to her arbitrary rule. Elijah, despite the initial trauma, found himself feeling a sense of relief and vindication. He had stood up to Karen and won, not just for himself, but for the entire community. He decided to seize the opportunity to help rebuild the HOA. He volunteered to serve on the board, vowing to ensure that it operated transparently and fairly. He advocated for policies that encouraged community building and fostered a sense of belonging, rather than focusing on petty regulations and arbitrary enforcement. In the months that followed, Elijah's vision slowly began to take shape. The HOA meetings became more collaborative, with residents actively participating in discussions and decision-making. Community events were organized, bringing neighbors together and fostering a sense of unity. The atmosphere in the neighborhood transformed, from one of fear and resentment to one of cooperation and mutual respect. As for Karen, she retreated into her house, a pariah in the community she once sought to control. Her silk robes and smug smile became a distant memory, replaced by the silence of isolation and regret. While some residents harbored feelings of animosity towards her, Elijah felt a sense of pity. He recognized that her actions were driven by a deep-seated need for control and validation, a need that had ultimately consumed her. Elijah went on to transform his outdated house into the amazing place he always knew it could be, without any further interruptions from neighborhood tyrants.